Hey everybody, Ryan with Bearded Rhino Designs here, bringing you a video of the assembly of the Xtool D1 5-watt laser. If you guys saw my previous video on the unboxing of the D1 5-watt, I really appreciate you watching that. And what I'll do today is just basically go through the video of my assembly of the D1 and what I did, explain and narrate that as I go along. It took me about an hour and 40 minutes to assemble. Now that's with some distractions and doing some minor things that weren't in the instructions just to assure that the assembly was going well. And I'll try to explain that as I go along in the video. But hopefully, I'm going to speed this video up at 2 times the speed and kind of explain what's going on through that. If we reach a lull in it, I will definitely speed it up. I don't want to take too much time out of your day, but I do want to explain how it went together and what I thought of the assembly at that point. So let's get started. So we'll go ahead and start this video. And what you see right off the bat is, well, good old Maverick in the background. He's a pretty good helper. But I decided, normally I don't look at a lot of instructions like most typical men, I guess. But this instruction booklet that came with the D1. As I recall, the earlier model D1s, they were shipped without an instruction book, and you went online to learn how to assemble it. Now, the booklet itself, not a lot of information in it as far as the assembly or anything that way. It did help. There are some diagrams and little diagrams of the screw sizes and things that way. But it's pretty self-explanatory when it does go together. You can figure it out through the manual, but just by looking at the parts, you can pretty much figure out how to assemble the device itself. So what I'm doing here is I'm figuring out the front, the back, and the sides, the XY axis. And right here, I noticed that there's a zip tie on one of the slides for the gantry for the axis there that the gantry goes on. It's holding the belt in that assembly right there. So you do have to remove that zip tie. And we'll start putting it together here. Now, those of you that do have an Xtool or that might know or have seen some other videos, again, I'm new to the laser world. So I'm a complete newbie. I understand if I'm asking a dumb question, but it doesn't explain it in the book or the manual. What's the button for on the Xtool? Is it an emergency shutoff? Is it a home? Because there's no safety stops for that. So curious to what the button is. Now I'm going to feel like an idiot, but again, I didn't see it in the manual, and I haven't researched it that far to figure out what it is. But I'm assuming it's an emergency shutoff. So we're just getting all 4 sides put together here. Let's make sure we're still at 2 times the speed here. Yes. Oh, and in the packaging, if you did see the unboxing video, great. If not, so they do send Allen wrenches and obviously all the fasteners to assemble the device itself. So I'm just finding the right screws here and obviously the Allen wrench that goes with that to assemble. I'm counting to make sure all of them showed up, and then I had all of them. Now, the good thing with Xtool, they send some extra screws just in case. So I do have, unless, of course, it's a typical assembly of mine and I had extra parts, but there were some extra screws to help with that in case you did lose one, or possibly maybe a thread was messed up. You'll see later on here, I felt like I was cross-threading one in the gantry setup there. So, and I'll talk about that when I get to it, but I wasn't. Excuse me. So if you're watching this video and you have a laser that's not an Xtool and you're thinking about getting an Xtool, would you mind leaving in the comments below why you're thinking about getting an Xtool diode laser, or what you think about the laser that you have now? Again, I'm hoping in getting into this field, I really am interested in, starting here. I have a 20 watt laser from Xtool that will be shipped at the end of May coming. And that's why I did buy the 5 watt device itself, so I could just immediately upgrade to the 20 watt laser. And I'm also using, I'll explain, I'm using the Lightburn software instead of the proprietary software from Xtool. And if you have another software that you prefer in your laser engraving and things that way, feel free to comment that below as well. Because again, I'm on the ground floor right now, just learning everything. Now here I'm just adding all the screws to assemble. Now I'm not tightening these all the way. I'm leaving them somewhat loose because I had a concern as I was assembling this that I'm sure these are made on, CNC, everything's measured. I had a concern that, anytime you're dealing with an X, Y, or Z axis, is the device square as you're assembling it? So you'll see here in just a minute that as I'm starting to tighten the screws all the way, that I'm concerned with, is it square? So I go and grab my framing square and make sure that it's all square as I'm tightening it up. Maybe something extra that I didn't need to do, but it was a concern of mine because, again, anytime you're dealing with different axes and something moving, I didn't want that to obscure any image or anything that way by being out of square. So that became a kind of a big concern for me. Maybe it was, not worth worrying about, but I definitely did make sure I took the extra measures for that. There's Maverick making sure I'm doing the right stuff. And you see right here, I'm just kind of wandering around. This is where I'm starting to think about, is this thing going to be square as I start tightening this up? Excuse me. So I clear off a spot on a table here. And you'll see I'll just move the whole device over to the table for a minute. It will be off screen, but I wanted to get it low enough where I could check the square and be able to see everything as I was tightening it up. So I'm going to speed this up. I actually go out to my garage to grab my square. So let me speed this up just a little bit. And for the video purposes, I decided, well, I better get this on video. So you'll see my square there, just an indicator of what I was doing at the time. Now that I know that it was square, I've tightened some of those up already, and I just finished tightening the rest of the screws. I will say right off the bat, the frame itself went together, as you can see, super easy. There really wasn't anything difficult in putting this together. Most all the parts went together very easy and fit very well. So the fit and finish and the assembly on the Xtool, very, very good. Let's jump ahead just a little bit here and move to putting on our X-axis for our gantry. This part right here, you'll see this screw I'm trying to get in to the side of the gantry, so I pull it back out. I just want to make sure it wasn't cross-threading. For whatever reason, that one screw, I just had a hard time getting it to start in the threaded portion. So, and I tried it in the other side of that, grabbed a new screw, it went right in. So I think I had one screw that the initial threads might have been just off just a little bit, and I didn't want to go in real easy. I didn't want to force anything through, just to make sure I didn't cross thread it and ruin that the threading in that or on the screw itself. So I finally figured out a couple screws that'll work, and we start screwing that crossbar for the x-axis on the gantry. We get them both started. Get them threaded just a little bit. See, in this one, for whatever reason, it's just not cooperating. So I want to move to the other side so I'm not having to hold it up with one hand and try to thread with the other. Get the other side put in and started. That way I can really work on this hole right here. This one, for whatever reason, was just giving me fits. In fact, this is probably the first part in the assembly process that just started hanging me up just a little bit, which is very minimal. So once we did get it started, get it threaded right, it went right together, and it didn't cross thread and went in perfect. You know what's funny here is I have a set of screwdriver type Allen wrenches, and for whatever reason I decided to use the one that came with the Xtool for the whole assembly, but that's all right. Can show people it can be done. All right, get that tightened up. So you see right here, this actual arm right along here on the y-axis, I believe, has an extra long belt, you know, and it was kind of moving around in there. So until you actually hook it up to this bar right here, which is what I think what we start doing next, it just kind of flops around there for a little while. Right now I'm installing the belt tensioning screws. So each belt here, the belt that I talked about here, the one along this axis, they all have their own tensioner. And they also have a locking screw that will lock the tensioner as well. So here's a locking screw right here, locking screw right here, and that's the actual belt tensioner on this side of it. And there's a locking screw on that back side. So you'll be able to see that over there as well. So right now I'm installing screws that come in this way for these locking tensioners, and then I just installed that one along the gantry axis for that one. So one thing I didn't like about having to turn this upside down is on the gantry itself, you have the gantry that moves side to side. Well, it's got the steel wheels and everything that sit on the bottom side here. And so us laying that upside down on this tile countertop was not fun, I guess you could say. I didn't like it. So I ended up going to get just a normal bath towel to lay that on when I start flipping those upside down. So now I'm getting in the position to where we install the actual bar that moves the belts off of this motor right here that will move that gantry back and forth. So right here I'm just not liking how it's sitting, so you'll see here in a minute. We'll just go ahead and advance it. So there's that long belt that we talked about earlier that just kept flopping around. You want to make sure it gets threaded back through and that none of it's twisted as you're putting it together, of course. And then it'll fit on a little gear that goes on the end of this, that's already on the end of the rod. And then this side of the rod has that locking shroud or collar that you tighten up. One end tightens to the bar and the other end tightens to the drive shaft for the motor. So right now, I'm starting to think about, okay, now we're going to put this belt on, and we're going to tighten this up. Is the gantry itself going to be square as I'm putting this together? Because if one belt's tighter than the other, or if the gearing is different on the shroud there, is it going to knock this gantry or this axis out of whack? So you can kind of see I'm moving. One side's moving, and the other side's not. So that got me thinking, well, before I tighten up the collar on the shroud, I need to make sure that it's going to stay square. So I start tightening the collar on, and I don't tighten the motor side yet completely. You'll see I'll get my square, and I want to make sure that the gantry itself is square before I tighten up that whole collar system. Again, maybe it's overkill, but I just really, and I don't have OCD, but it just really wanted to make sure it stayed, plumb and true. So right here, excuse me, that's what I'm doing. I'm squaring it up with the frame. I know my frame is square, so I'm squaring, making sure that this gantry or this axis is square to the frame itself, and it is. Checking the tightness and the tension on the belts. I can feel that the one of them's just not the same. So I go ahead and tighten that up. So once you finish tightening it, you want to obviously lock the locking screw so it keeps that same tension on it. It keeps it from moving. So now I believe we're going to start installing the wiring and the zip ties that hold the wiring and everything together. So right here I know it's asking me to flip the device upside down again. And I know I just didn't like that before. That's why I hung that edge over so these weren't riding on that tile countertop. So I just grabbed, again, just a normal bath towel just to set that gantry and those steel wheels on. So there in my left hand, you'll see the actual main wiring harness for the laser, the motors, and they obviously connect to the motherboard of the device. So there's two wires. And the good thing is the ends of the wires are color coded. They will also be color coded to the end of your motherboard and or the drive motors as well. There is a certain way that the plugins do plug in, but it won't allow you to plug them in wrong. But you just want to make sure if it's too tight and not going in right, then you want to make sure you're putting it in the right way and that you're not forcing it in and bending pins. So this wire here specifically ran from the motherboard to the first drive motor that's installed on the frame. And I'm just making sure that I'm plugging it in the right way. And there it goes. That easy. Now they supply some zip ties. Xtool supplies zip ties that go in these holes right here. And you can zip tie the wire up to that. Very simple. We'll move through this. As you see, I'm just zip tying that wire to that frame. Making sure that there is a little bit of slack in there and that it's just not over tight. All right, I've gone back through, clipped the tops of the zip ties off, or the extension that's obviously waste. And I noticed that where I've cut them off, and I've used some wire cutters, that it's a little bit sharp on those edges. And as much as you're moving your laser around and things that way, I didn't want those sharp edges, so I just take a utility knife and shave off those edges till they're nice and smooth, just to keep fingers from being poked and just comfortable. Okay, now we got to turn it the other way. I think I picked this up, turn around 3 or 4 times trying to figure out the right way and the most comfortable way to install this wiring harness. So I may move it 3 or 4 or 5 times. I can't make it easy right off the bat usually. And again, these are all color coded. A lot of them are different sizes, so you can definitely figure out where they plug in. It's really, really easy. Now that red wire right there, that was my nemesis for about 10 minutes of this assembly. This was one of the hardest parts for me. The way that the motherboard attachment is for that connector is it's in there in such a way where it has to bend 90 degrees and then plug in, and there's just not a lot of room between the frame and the motherboard and everything to plug that in, that it just took me a little bit of time. And obviously you'll see I'll put on some reading glasses and magnifying glasses to make sure I get that in right and stuff, that to make sure it goes in just fine. But it did take me a little bit of time to get that dang red wire plugged in. Right here, I'm searching for my reading glasses. This is, I'm almost 50 years old, and it's catching up with me on some of this stuff. I hate to admit it, but I can't see that well, so I need to grab a light and some reading glasses to get that plugged in. But eventually, we finally get that done. In fact, I think I'm going to fast forward it. You can kind of see. No, I'm still working on it. I move my hands here, you'll be able to see the red connector in on the motherboard and kind of how it goes in there. Again, you know, I don't know if Xtool can change something that way to make it a little easier for the assembly. Maybe it was just me just having a hard time with it, but it just felt like the way that it was going together was just not the best way to engineer that portion. Again, not a huge deal. It went in, works fine, but it just took, again, probably took an extra, honestly, 8 minutes or so in the assembly of this, just to get that wire in. You know, obviously you're dealing with wires in a connector. You want to make sure you're not yanking and pulling on them and bending them the wrong way. So you either A, ruin the connector or have to resolder some things. So that, you know, that plays into a little bit of being a little more careful and maybe taking a little extra time. All right, finally get it in. I think I'd probably take a drink of soda and decide I'm ready to move on to the next parts here. Now we're attaching that same wiring harness attaches to the gantry motor. And obviously it has some zip ties too to secure it to the frame as well. One thing I did notice, and you're going to see in the end or later on in this video, this wiring harness itself, I feel maybe another thing that Xtool might have engineered a little bit different, either putting a different material or a chain track or something like that for that to run through, because it just seems like it has the tendency to be in the way and can get into your cutting surface as the gantry is moving forward and backward, and it could get in and get under the laser if you're not careful. There might be a better way to engineer that. I might find a better way to wire it too in the meantime, but it just seems like that it just, for lack of a better term, it kind of flops back and forth. If the gantry's at the furthest portion and starts coming back and the slack is built up in that wiring harness, it can just fold inside into your cutting surface. Cutting off some zip ties just like we did before. Okay, we're still wiring this harness in. So right here, so like you can see kind of what this wiring harness is doing. It's not fully attached yet to the, I mean, it is to the gantry or to the axis, but not to the laser and the things that way. But as I'm moving it back and forth, I folded it outside of the frame itself to get it to the slack to move outside of the frame and not inside. But again, if you're not paying attention to that sometime, there's a tendency that might just go inside. Now we're ready to install the laser itself. Again, this is a 5-watt laser. I'll be changing this out as soon as my 20-watt comes in, but I want to learn how to use it, and we're going to use the 5-watt for a little while. And I think it'll do fine. Maybe a little slower than what most other lasers are going to do, but it should do just fine. I've installed the end of the harness. I'm trying to install it into the actual laser itself. It has a connector on the top side, and then the harness slides through a slot that just rides back and forth on the laser. But there is a little offset from the slot in the laser to the connector itself, where it just does not slide into the connector very easy. So I had to use the Allen wrench or little screwdriver just to get that connector pushed into the laser connector itself. Once I did that, it was fine. Now it's time, obviously, to install some other zip ties. Now, when you're installing these zip ties, you want to make sure that you can take as much slack as you can from the harness itself onto the gantry, because it's going to need all that slack to move from one side of that gantry clear to the other. And one thing I've noticed with this harness, and I think I just mentioned it earlier, is where the wire comes out for the gantry motor from the harness came out in such a way where it didn't allow enough slack in the wiring harness to fully extend out as far as it could go. So you'll see I had to modify the harness. I had to actually cut the shroud that goes around the wiring harness on the harness itself to make sure that I had enough slack in the wires so it could fully extend. So I'm moving forward. So here's where I'm realizing, okay, first of all, it's not extending clear to the end of the gantry. So now I've got to figure something out. And right in here, I don't know if you'll see it when I turn this over, is where the wiring harness connects into the gantry motor that sits right down here. And that is creating an instance where there's not enough slack. And I'll try to explain that if I get a good enough view here. So it plugs in right here into the motor. And you'll see, so there's the connector that goes off this harness into the motor. Well, another portion of those wires go off obviously up to the laser itself. Where the hole came out for this connector out of the harness, there is not enough room to allow enough slack. So this is the hairy portion where I'm going to cut the harness back with a pair of scissors far enough so it'll allow some slack to move the rest of the wires down. Obviously, you want to make sure, one, you're only cutting the harness shroud, and two, that you're not pushing on any wire or attempting to cut any wire as you're moving your scissors through. Now, I could have used the utility knife for it, but again, I felt I had more control using these scissors to cut the shroud. Now, it's a woven shroud of I believe I don't know if it's monofilament or it's a fiber filament shroud that once it's actually cut, it frays, kind of like a rope. So you will need to do something to make sure that the frayed ends aren't, one, jabbing into wires, or two, unfraying some more. So I ended up burning these with a small lighter, butane lighter. And in doing that, you want to make sure you're away from the wires itself and you're not melting those wires, and you're moving the flame enough to where you're not heating those enough to compromise the integrity of them. This took a little bit of time. This was next to the connecting the red connector. This is the only thing I really had to modify from factory to make sure that everything worked okay. And it took just a little bit of time. So without the threading issue on the gantry of the screw, which was super simple, the red connecting wire onto the motherboard, and this wiring harness assembly itself not being long enough, or the hole in the wrong spot, and I had to reposition it, probably could have assembled this whole thing within an hour and 10 to 15 minutes, maybe an hour if you're lucky. So because I squared things up. I did probably a lot of things I didn't need to do. So you could probably easily assemble this Xtool, or it'd be fair to say that you could assemble it. So you see, I'm just shaking it around to make sure I'm not, and I'm also speeding up this video, so I'm not having a seizure, making sure that I'm not heating portions that don't need to be heated on that. So that is that portion. Took a little bit of electrical tape and wrapped around the frayed edge that I've just basically heated up and singed back, just to guarantee that it all stays together good and it is secure. Now we're going to see if we have enough slack to reach our furthest extension of the gantry so the laser can reach that far left side of that axis without too much tension on the wiring harness itself or on the motor. Or obviously it's going to put tension on the harness, it's going to put tension on the belt and everything if there's not enough slack in that. So once we determine there's enough slack, we go ahead and secure that up, start cutting the zip ties, and get those all cut off and smooth. So after I cut these off and smoothed them, I actually rotated that, what would you call it, the zip tie clasp, if you will. Rotated that down so it's not sitting up on top of that, the top of that gantry. You see, I just turn those down so they face underneath and they're out of the way. And at that point, our Xtool D1 5-watt laser is assembled. Not very hard. Little lengthy video, guys. If you stuck around this long, thank you. I mean, I tried to speed it up 2 times to make sure that it wasn't overly lengthy. But again, it might have turned out that way. But again, if you stuck around that long, I really appreciate it. And thank you for watching. And this is Ryan with Bearded Rhino Designs, and I'll see you in the next one.